Hello everyone, Professor Kurzluck here. So I wanted to make a video about democratic backsliding. So touched briefly on it in class and touched briefly on it in our earlier video, but I wanted to make its own video because it's an important part of comparative politics for us to think about before we move on to thinking about what is authoritarianism and the differences between a democracy and an authoritarian regime. So often when we talk about democracy in a political science and political science, we often kind of treat it as something that countries either have or they don't have. But in reality, democracy is not a permanent achievement. It is a political system that can weaken, that can erode, and even reverse over time. This process is known as democratic backsliding. So, democratic backsliding refers to a gradual decline in the quality of democratic governance, where institutions, norms, and rights that support democracy are weakened rather than suddenly overthrown. So, unlike classic military coups or revolutions, democratic backsliding usually happens incrementally through legal challenges and at times with public support. This makes it harder to recognize and harder to stop. To understand democratic backsliding, we need to move away from dramatic images of tanks in the street taking away democratic rights and instead focus on how power shifts quietly within institutions. So let's start with what democratic backsliding is not. Backsliding is not the complete collapse of democracy overnight. Elections usually continue. Constitutions oftentimes remain in place. Courts still exist. Legislatures still meet. Legislative bodies still meet. What changes is how these institutions function, how independent they are, and whether they still constrain those in power. In a healthy democracy, institutions limit executive authority, protect minority rights, ensure fair competition, and enforce the rule of law. In a backsliding democracy, these same institutions remain on paper but become less effective, less independent, and more polarized. So, one of the most common drivers of democratic backsliding is the concentration of executive power. In many cases, leaders come to power through democratic elections and then begin to argue that electoral victory gives them a mandate to to roll without constraint. They frame institutions like courts, legislatures, and independent agencies as obstacles to the will of the people. This rhetoric is quite powerful. By claiming to represent the real people, leaders justify the weakening of the checks and balances that are hallmarks to democratic systems in the name of democracy itself. Executives may begin by expanding their use of executive orders, emergency powers, or decree authority. Over time, legislatures become less effective as independent actors and more like extensions of the executive branch. Another key institution affected by backsliding is the judiciary. Independent courts are essential for democracy because they enforce constitutional limits and protect rights. In backsliding systems, Courts are rarely abolished outright or overnight. Instead, they are captured. This can happen through changes to appointment roles, court packing, maybe forced retirement of judges, or disciplinary mechanisms that intimidate judges to maybe make them leave or rule in certain manners. Courts may still exist, but their willingness to roll against the government declines. Legal challenges become less meaningful, even though formal procedures will remain. The media is another early target. Free and independent media provides citizens with information necessary for democratic choice. In backsliding democracies, governments often do not ban media outright. Instead, they apply economic pressure, regulatory harassment, or selective access. Critical outlets may lose licenses, face lawsuits, or be labeled as foreign agents, or even enemies of the state. Pro government media gain privileged access and visibility. Over time, the information environment becomes skewed, even though media technically remains free. Electoral institutions are also gradually reshaped. Elections usually continue usually continue even during this time of democratic backsliding, but they become less competitive. Roles governing um, uh, districting, campaign finance, voter registration, and ballot access are altered in ways that advantage those in power. Opposition parties still exist, but they face higher barriers. The result is not the absence of elections, but elections that are increasingly unfair. Civil society and protests are also impacted during this stage of democratic backsliding. Organizations that monitor government behavior, defend rights, or mobilize citizens often face new regulation, funding restrictions, or state surveillance. Protest may remain legal, but policing becomes more aggressive, permits harder to obtain, and penalties more severe. The goal is not necessarily to eliminate dissent, but to raise its costs. So, an important feature of democratic backsliding is that it often enjoys initial popular support. Many citizens support leaders who promise order, who promise stability, national pride, or protection from perceived threats. When democratic institutions are portrayed as corrupt, inefficient, or elitist, weakening them can seem reasonable, even desirable. This is why backsliding is so often happens in polarized societies. When citizens see opponents as existential threats, they are more willing to tolerate democratic erosion if it harms the other side. Over time, however, the costs of backsliding become clearer. For citizens, democratic backsliding changes everyday political life in subtle but important ways. People may become less willing to speak openly about politics. Journalists may self censor. Activists hesitant to organize. Professors may self censor. Legal protections become uncertain. Trust in institutions declines, not because institutions disappear overnight, but because citizens no longer believe they operate fairly. Participation itself also changes. Voting may feel less meaningful. Opposition voters may disengage, while supporters of the ruling party dominate public spaces. Politics becomes less about persuasion and more about loyalty. Importantly, democratic backsliding does not always lead to full authoritarianism. Some countries stabilize at what's considered a hybrid regime, combining democratic procedures with authoritarian practices. Others continue to slide further and further towards authoritarianism. The path, though, is not inevitable, but reversal becomes harder over time as institutions become weaker and they weaken, and opposition capacity declines. So, why does democratic backsliding matter? It matters because democracy's core premise is not just participation, but accountability. When institutions stop constraining power, citizens lose their ability to hold leaders responsible for decisions that affect their lives. Backsliding also reshapes political culture. Norms of compromise, tolerance, and mutual legitimacy erode. Politics becomes a zero sum game. Winning becomes more important than governing fairly. And finally, democratic backsliding and challenges democratic backsliding challenges the assumption that democracy naturally progresses or sustains itself. Democracies require maintenance. They depend on institutions, norms, and citizens willing to defend them, or even when doing so is inconvenient or politically costly. So, understanding democratic backsliding helps us see democracy not as a destination, but as a process, one that can move forward or backward depending on political choices, institutional design, and civic engagement. That is why political scientists increasingly focus not just on how democracies emerge, but on how they unravel and what, if anything, can stop that process. Thank you.